The October afternoon light slanted through the maple trees along Oakwood Drive, casting long shadows that stretched across the pavement like reaching fingers. 6-year-old Tommy Reynolds clutched his Batman lunchbox tighter, his sneakers scuffing against the sidewalk as he walked the familiar 4 blocks from Westfield Elementary to his home. The air carried the scent of burning leaves and the promise of Halloween just weeks away. "See you tomorrow, Tommy," called Mikey from across the street, breaking into a run toward his own house. Tommy waved, watching his friend disappear into his front yard. 2 more blocks to go. He'd made this journey dozens of times since starting first grade, part of his mother's careful plan to give him big boy responsibility while keeping him safe in their quiet Columbus suburb. The route never varied. Straight down Oakwood, right at the corner market, and then the final stretch of Elm Street to his blue 2-story home with the tire swing hanging from the oak tree in the front yard. At the corner market, Mr. Wilson was sweeping the sidewalk. He nodded at Tommy as he always did. "Afternoon, young man. Tell your mom I've got those coupons she asked about." "Yes, sir," Tommy replied, shifting his lunchbox to his other hand. The corner market would be the last place anyone would see Tommy Reynolds that day, or for the next 44 years. He should have been home by now. Martha Reynolds glanced at the kitchen clock for the 5th time in as many minutes, her fingers working nervously at the dish towel in her hands. It was 3:45 p.m. Tommy was always through the door by 3:30, cheeks flushed, backpack dropping to the floor, despite her constant reminders to hang it up. "Maybe he stopped to play with a friend," her husband David suggested, looking up from the stack of bills he'd been sorting at the kitchen table, but his expression betrayed his own unease. "Without telling me?" Martha shook her head, already reaching for her coat. "He knows better." By 4:15, Martha had walked Tommy's route twice. By 4:30, David had joined the search, driving the surrounding streets. At 4:45, they called the police. "Has it been 24 hours?" asked the officer who answered. "He's 6 years old," Martha hissed, her voice breaking. "He's never late. Something's wrong." To their credit, the Columbus police didn't wait. By nightfall, officers were combing the neighborhood. Flashlights swept across backyards and wooded areas. Tommy's school photo, gap-toothed smile, cowlick at the crown of his head, freckles dusting his nose, was copied and distributed. Missing, the hastily made flyers proclaimed in bold black letters, "Mr. Wilson from the corner market confirmed seeing Tommy at approximately 3:20 p.m. He was alone," he told Detective Frank Moretti. "Same as always. Nothing struck me as unusual." "Did you see which way he went after passing your store?" Moretti asked, his pen poised above his notepad. Mr. Wilson's brow furrowed. "He turned onto Elm like he always does. I only saw him for a moment before I went back inside." But Tommy had never made it to Elm Street. Not a single neighbor reported seeing him after he passed the corner market. It was as if the space between the store and the turn onto Elm Street had opened up and swallowed the boy whole. By morning, the search had expanded. Police officers knocked on doors within a mile radius. Volunteers gathered at the Reynolds home, organized into search parties. Local television stations interrupted their regular programming with bulletins about the missing boy. In the Reynolds living room, Martha sat rigidly on the edge of the sofa, refusing food or rest, her eyes fixed on the front door, as if willing it to open. "We will find him," David promised, his arm around her shoulders, his voice hoarse from shouting Tommy's name through the night. Martha said nothing. She was remembering the morning's rushed goodbye, Tommy gulping down the last of his cereal, her distracted kiss on the top of his head as she packed his lunch. Had she told him she loved him? She couldn't remember. Detective Moretti arrived with another officer shortly before noon. "Mrs. Reynolds, Mr. Reynolds," he began, and something in his tone made Martha's heart stutter. "We found Tommy's lunchbox." It was discovered in a drainage ditch 2 blocks from the corner market, in the opposite direction from the Reynolds home. The Batman design was unmistakable, though mud had partially obscured the hero's emblem. Inside, Tommy's uneaten apple and half of a peanut butter sandwich remained. "This doesn't mean," Moretti began, but Martha was already shaking her head. a keening sound escaping her throat. He would never leave his lunchbox, never, she whispered. The discovery shifted the investigation. What had been a missing child case was now treated as a likely abduction. The FBI was called in. Agents in dark suits filled the Reynolds home, setting up a command center in the dining room. Phones were tapped in case of ransom calls. Martha and David's lives were scrutinized, their friends, their enemies, their finances. The media descended, camera crews parked on their lawn, reporters shouting questions whenever they stepped outside. "Do you have any idea who might have taken your son? Have you received any demands? How are you holding up, Mrs. Reynolds?" Martha stopped answering the door or looking at the television. The sight of Tommy's face on the screen, now a national sensation, was more than she could bear. 3 weeks after Tommy disappeared, Martha sat at his bedroom window, staring out at the neighborhood now stripped of its autumn colors. November had blown in cold and merciless. The search parties had dwindled. The FBI presence had reduced to a single agent who called every other day with the same message: no new leads. The bedroom remained untouched, Batman sheets still rumpled where Tommy had hastily made his bed that morning. Legos still assembled into a half-finished spaceship on his desk. Pajamas still draped over the chair where he'd tossed them in his rush to get dressed. "Martha!" David stood in the doorway, his silhouette a shadow she barely recognized. Grief had hollowed him, aged him a decade in less than a month. "Detective Moretti is here." Downstairs, Moretti sat heavily in the armchair, declining the offer of coffee. His face was grave, his eyes avoiding Martha's. "We've exhausted all leads," he said finally. "We've interviewed over 300 people. Checked every registered sex offender in a 50-mile radius, followed up on every tip." He paused. "The FBI is scaling back their involvement." "What are you saying?" David asked, though they all knew. "I'm saying we don't stop looking, but the active investigation is going to be reduced." Moretti leaned forward. "I promise you we will never close this case, not until we have answers." But Martha heard what he wasn't saying. They didn't expect to find Tommy alive. Perhaps they didn't expect to find him at all. Thousands of children went missing in America every year. Not all of them came home. That night, she sat on Tommy's bed, holding his favorite stuffed bear, a worn brown thing he'd named Mr. Growls. "I will never stop looking for you," she whispered to the empty room. "Not ever." 20 miles away, in a modest ranch house in a different Columbus suburb, a man named Richard Miller tucked a boy into bed. "Good night, Peter," he said, smoothing the child's hair back from his forehead. The boy blinked up at him with solemn eyes. "When is Mommy coming back?" Richard's expression tightened momentarily before settling back into a reassuring smile. "I told you, buddy, Mommy had to go away for a while, but you've got me, and we're going to be just fine." The boy, who had been known as Tommy Reynolds just 3 weeks earlier, nodded uncertainly. He didn't fully understand what was happening, only that everything had changed one afternoon when his daddy had picked him up in a different car than usual, saying there was an emergency. There had been a long drive, a new house, new clothes, a new name to learn. "You're Peter Miller now," his father had told him. "It's very important that you remember that. Can you do that for me?" Tommy, now Peter, had nodded, sensing the gravity in his father's tone. "Good boy," Richard had said, relief evident in his voice. "This is our fresh start. Just you and me." "Ideen," as the boy drifted towards sleep, fragments of memories flickered through his mind. A blue house, a tire swing, a woman's face and the scent of her perfume. But these images were already beginning to fade, replaced by the unfamiliar ceiling of his new bedroom and the strange silence of a house without his mother's voice. 5 years passed, then 10. The Reynolds case grew cold, filed away with other unsolved disappearances. Martha and David divorced in 1985, the strain of their loss fracturing whatever foundation their marriage had once had. David eventually moved to Florida, remarried, had another child, a daughter he named Teresa, though he called her Tess, unable to bear another name that started with T. He kept Tommy's photo on his desk, but turned it face down when the weight of the grief became too much. Martha stayed in the blue house on Elm Street. She took down the tire swing, but kept Tommy's room exactly as it had been. Once a year, on the anniversary of his disappearance, she walked his route home from school, retracing the steps her son had taken that October afternoon, ending at the corner market where Mr. Wilson, now stooped with age, would wordlessly hand her a flower. She joined support groups for parents of missing children. She helped establish a foundation that distributed flyers and later websites featuring age-progressed photos of Tommy and others like him. What would he look like at 16, at 26, at 36? Artists created renderings, but Martha couldn't reconcile them with the 6-year-old whose face was frozen in her memory. You should sell the house, friends told her. Start fresh somewhere. But Martha refused. What if he comes home and we're not here? She would ask. What if he's looking for us? For 44 years, Martha Reynolds kept her vigil, even as her hair grayed and her hands grew gnarled with arthritis. Even as the world changed around her, cell phones, internet, social media, she maintained her routine, preserving her son's memory and the slim hope that someday, somehow, she would know what had happened to him. She could never have imagined how that answer would finally come, or how it would begin with a simple gift. A DNA test kit given to a 50-year-old man by his wife on his birthday in 2023. A man named Peter Miller, who had lived his entire adult life without questioning who he was, until the results came back with a notification. DNA match found. Possible parent-child relationship. The name attached to this match? Martha Reynolds. Peter Miller stared at the email notification on his phone, the bright screen illuminating his face in the dim light of his Seattle kitchen. It was just past 5 a.m., the March rain tapping against the windows like impatient fingers. He had been awake for hours, unable to sleep after seeing the DNA results the night before. DNA match found. Possible parent-child relationship. The coffee maker gurgled in the background, filling the room with the scent of dark roast. Peter ran a hand through his salt and pepper hair, his mind racing. For his 50th birthday 2 months ago, his wife Caroline had given him a DNA testing kit. To learn more about your health markers, she'd said, and maybe find some distant cousins. It had seemed innocent enough, a novelty gift that had sat unopened on his desk until Caroline had finally insisted he try it. Now, the results had shattered the foundations of his life. The name on the match, Martha Reynolds, meant nothing to him, but the relationship prediction was unmistakable. 99.8% probability of a parent-child connection. That's impossible, Peter had whispered when the notification first appeared. His mother, Sarah Miller, had died of breast cancer when he was 22. His father, Richard, had passed just 5 years ago after a sudden heart attack. There was no Martha Reynolds in his family tree. The floor creaked behind him, and Peter turned to see Caroline standing in the doorway, her robe pulled tight around her. "You're up early," she said, her voice still rough with sleep. Then, noticing his expression, "What's wrong?" Peter handed her the phone wordlessly. Caroline's eyes widened as she read the screen. "I don't understand," she said finally. "Could it be a mistake?" "I've been researching all night," Peter replied. "The error rate for parent-child matches is virtually zero. This woman," he hesitated, "she's my biological mother." Caroline sank into a chair across from him, her face pale in the kitchen's half-light. "But that would mean that my parents weren't my parents," Peter finished. "Or at least, my mother wasn't my mother." Caroline reached across the table to take his hand. "Maybe your father had a relationship before he met Sarah? Maybe this Martha is a birth mother who gave you up for adoption." Peter shook his head. "I have my birth certificate. Sarah Miller is listed as my mother. Besides, I have memories of her from when I was very young." But did he? Peter tried to recall his earliest memories. There was his 6th birthday party with a Superman cake, the camping trip to Lake Erie when he was 8, his father teaching him to ride a bike in the driveway of their Columbus home. Before that, what? A strange haziness clouded his early childhood memories. "I need to know who this Martha Reynolds is," Peter said. "I need to understand what this means." By mid-morning, Peter sat at his desk in the Home Office, a legal pad filled with notes beside his laptop. As a software engineer who specialized in database systems, research came naturally to him. He'd already created a methodical approach to unraveling the mystery. Step 1. Learn everything possible about Martha Reynolds. A simple Google search had yielded surprising results. Martha Reynolds wasn't just anyone. She was the mother of a missing child. The case had its own Wikipedia page, Disappearance of Tommy Reynolds. Peter scrolled through the article, his coffee growing cold beside him. Thomas James Reynolds, born April 12, 1973, disappeared on October 15, 1979, at age 6, while walking home from school in Columbus, Ohio. Despite extensive searches and media coverage, no trace of Reynolds was found beyond his abandoned lunchbox, discovered 2 blocks from where he was last seen. The case remains one of Ohio's most notorious unsolved child disappearances. There was a photo, a school portrait of a small boy with a cowlick and freckles. Peter stared at it, feeling an unsettling sense of familiarity, like looking at a dream he couldn't quite remember upon waking. His eyes moved to the next image, an age progression estimate of what Tommy might look like at 40. The resemblance to Peter's own face was undeniable. "Oh my God," he whispered. He quickly calculated the dates. Tommy Reynolds would be 50 now, exactly Peter's age. Born in April 1973, Peter's birth month and year. Disappeared from Columbus, Ohio, where Peter had grown up until his father moved them to Seattle when he was 16. The room seemed to tilt. Peter gripped the edge of his desk, his breath coming in shallow gasps. It couldn't be possible. And yet the evidence was aligning with terrible precision. He minimized the browser window, unable to look at Tommy Reynolds' face any longer. From his wallet he pulled out his driver's license, Peter Richard Miller, DOBs 04-12-1973. The birth date matched Tommy's exactly. "Caroline!" he called, his voice unsteady. "Caroline, I need you!" His wife appeared in the doorway, alarmed by his tone. "What is it? What did you find?" Peter turned the laptop toward her. "I think—" He couldn't finish the sentence, the words too enormous to articulate. Caroline read the Wikipedia page, her hand coming up to cover her mouth. "Peter," she said finally, "you need to talk to a professional about this. This is beyond anything we can handle on our own." Peter nodded mutely. She was right. The implications were staggering, criminal. If he was Tommy Reynolds, then his father, the man he had loved and grieved, was a kidnapper. And somewhere in Ohio, a woman had spent 44 years wondering what had happened to her son. The Seattle rain had intensified by the time Peter parked outside the law offices of Westlake & Associates. The 6th-floor conference room overlooked a steel-grey Puget Sound, whitecaps visible on the choppy water. Attorney Diane Westlake had rearranged her schedule upon hearing the bare bones of Peter's situation. "To be clear," she said after Peter had explained everything, "you believe you may be this missing child, Tommy Reynolds, based on a DNA match and coincidental birth dates." "Yes," Peter replied. His hands trembled slightly as he passed her printouts of his research. "The DNA match shows I'm related to Tommy's mother. I was raised in Columbus by Richard Miller, who claimed to be my father. We moved to Seattle when I was 16, which he faltered, which Richard told me was for a job opportunity." Diane examined the documents, her expression carefully neutral. "And your mother, the woman who raised you?" "Sarah Miller. She died when I was in college. Cancer." Peter swallowed hard. "I have no memories of any other mother." "None at all from before age 6? Peter hesitated. "That's what's strange. My memories before that are hazy, fragmented. I always assumed that was normal, that no one remembers much from that young." Diane nodded thoughtfully. "It could be a natural childhood amnesia. Or," she left the alternative unspoken, "or his memories had been suppressed, either naturally from trauma or deliberately by Richard Miller." "What do I do now?" Peter asked. "I need to know the truth. If you're serious about pursuing this, There are several steps. Diane leaned forward. First, we need to confirm the DNA match with additional testing. Second, we should discreetly contact law enforcement in Columbus about the Reynolds case. Third, she paused, you need to consider what this means for Martha Reynolds. If you are her son, she's been waiting 44 years for answers. Peter stared out at the rain-lashed windows. I've been thinking about her non-stop, imagining what it must have been like all these years. He turned back to Diane. But what if I'm wrong? What if there's some other explanation? I don't want to give this woman false hope. That's why we proceed carefully, Diane assured him. This isn't just about you discovering your past. It's potentially about solving a decades-old crime and bringing closure to a family that suffered an unimaginable loss. The weight of her words settled over Peter. His entire identity, every memory, every relationship, even his name, was suddenly cast in doubt. And if his suspicions were correct, the father he had loved was responsible for destroying another family. I'll need to tell my children, he said quietly. Sam is in his final year at UCLA, and Lily just started at Washington State. This will upend their world too. Diane nodded sympathetically. Take it one step at a time. Let's confirm the DNA first. I'll make some calls to arrange expedited testing. That evening, Peter sat in his car outside his home for nearly an hour, unable to bring himself to go inside and face Caroline. The rain had finally stopped, leaving the world washed clean and gleaming under streetlights. His phone buzzed with a text from his son, Sam, something about summer internship plans. Normal life continuing while Peter's reality imploded. Finally, he entered the house to find Caroline waiting in the living room. She had built a fire in the fireplace, and 2 glasses of wine sat on the coffee table. How did it go with the lawyer? She asked, as Peter sank into the couch beside her. She's arranging additional DNA testing, he replied, and reaching out to contacts in law enforcement. He took a long sip of wine. I keep thinking about Richard, trying to make sense of it. If I'm really Tommy Reynolds, then my father... He still struggled with the word. He took me, stole me from my family, made me believe a lie my entire life. Caroline moved closer, resting her head on his shoulder. We don't know the whole story yet. Maybe there's more to it. What possible explanation could there be for kidnapping a 6-year-old? Peter's voice rose in frustration. And what about Sarah? Did she know? Was she complicit in this? The questions had been tormenting him all day. He had loved his parents. Richard had been strict at times, overprotective even, but he had also coached Peter's Little League teams, helped him with science projects, supported him through college. Sarah had been warm, gentle, always ready with a hug or a plate of homemade cookies. Could they have built those relationships on the foundation of such a terrible crime? I keep wondering about Martha Reynolds, Peter said after a long silence. What she's like, whether she ever gave up hoping. He pulled out his phone, opened the browser. There was a news article about her from just last year. She still lives in Columbus in the same house. She's 81 now. Boo. The photo accompanying the article showed an elderly woman with silver hair and Tommy's eyes, Peter's eyes, standing on the porch of a blue 2-story home. Despite her age, she stood straight, her gaze direct as she addressed the reporter. I never lost hope, Peter read aloud from the article. Some people think that's foolish after all this time, but a mother knows. I would feel it if my son were gone. Somewhere out there, Tommy is alive, and I will keep waiting until I find him, or until I take my last breath. Caroline wiped away a tear. What are you going to do? Peter set down his phone, his decision crystallizing. If the additional testing confirms it, I'm going to Columbus. I need to see her. I need to understand what happened. I'll come with you, Caroline said immediately. Peter squeezed her hand gratefully. Then a thought struck him, and he pulled away. What do I even call myself now? Am I Peter Miller or Tommy Reynolds? I've built my entire life as Peter, but if that identity was based on a lie... You're still you, Caroline said firmly. Whatever name you use, whatever the truth about your past turns out to be, you're still the same person I've known and loved for 25 years, the same father to Sam and Lily, the same friend to everyone who cares about you. But Peter wasn't so sure. As he stared into the dancing flames of the fireplace, he wondered what parts of himself might have been different if he'd grown up as Tommy Reynolds. What dreams, what talents, what relationships might have flourished in that other life, the life that had been stolen from him on an October afternoon 44 years ago. The question haunted him as he drifted into an uneasy sleep that night, dreaming of blue houses and tire swings and a woman's face that he could almost, but not quite, remember. The Columbus skyline had changed dramatically in the decades since Peter had last seen it. Glass skyscrapers now towered where once stood more modest structures. The rental car hummed beneath him as he navigated streets that felt at once familiar and foreign. Caroline sat beside him, consulting the GPS on her phone, though Peter found he remembered the way with unsettling clarity. "Turn left at the next light," she instructed, glancing up from the screen. "Then it should be about half a mile ahead." The confirmatory DNA test had left no room for doubt. The results, which had arrived 10 days after Peter's meeting with Diane Westlake, showed a 99.9% probability that Martha Reynolds was his biological mother. The FBI had been notified immediately, and a case that had been cold for over 4 decades was suddenly active again. "We'd like you to come to Columbus, Mr. Miller," Special Agent Teresa Delgado had said during their video call. "We're reopening the investigation, and your testimony about your childhood, any memories you might have, could be crucial." "What about Martha Reynolds?" Peter had asked. "Has she been told?" Agent Delgado's expression had softened. "Not yet. We want to proceed carefully. This kind of news, after so long, we need to handle it delicately." Now, as they approached the old neighborhood, Peter's hands tightened on the steering wheel. They had arrived in Columbus the previous evening, checking into a downtown hotel. Today, they would meet with the FBI at the field office. Tomorrow, if all went according to plan, Peter would meet the mother he had been taken from 44 years earlier. The thought made his stomach twist with anxiety. He had spent the past 2 weeks trying to recover any memories from before his 6th birthday, sitting in quiet rooms with his eyes closed, looking at photos of Columbus from the 1970s, even consulting a therapist who specialized in recovered memories. But the past remained stubbornly locked away, accessible only in fragments too fleeting and insubstantial to grasp. "There it is," Caroline said softly, pointing ahead. Peter slowed the car as they approached Oakwood Drive. The street where Tommy Reynolds had begun his last walk home from school looked ordinary in the May sunshine. Tree-lined, peaceful, suburban. Peter pulled to the curb, putting the car in park but leaving the engine running. "Do you want to get out?" Caroline asked. Peter shook his head. "Not yet. I just needed to see it." He stared out the window, trying to superimpose the memories of a 6-year-old boy over the scene before him. Had anything stirred within him? Any flash of recognition? But there was nothing. Just the hollow ache that had become his constant companion since the DNA results arrived. "We should go," he said finally. "The FBI is expecting us at 11. As they pulled away, Peter didn't notice the elderly woman watching from her front porch across the street, her gaze following their car with curious intensity. The Columbus FBI field office was a nondescript building in a commercial district, its interior all muted colors and functional furniture. Peter and Caroline were escorted to a conference room where 3 people waited. Special Agent Delgado, whom they recognized from the video call, an older man introduced as Detective Frank Moretti, now retired but who had worked the original case, and a woman in her 40s who was introduced as Assistant District Attorney Lydia Harmon. "Thank you for coming, Mr. Miller," Agent Delgado began once they were seated. "I know this has been an incredibly difficult time for you." Peter nodded, his mouth dry. "I'm still trying to process everything. It feels unreal." Detective Moretti leaned forward, his weathered face etched with lines of a career spent confronting human tragedy. "I never thought I'd see this day," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. "I was a young officer when Tommy disappeared. First big case I worked. It stayed with me all these years." "What happens now?" Caroline asked, her hand finding Peter's under the table. We're building a case, Ada Harmon explained. This is a unique situation. The statute of limitations has expired on kidnapping, but there's no statute of limitations on murder in Ohio. While we now know Tommy, she glanced at Peter apologetically. Excuse me, Mr. Miller is alive. The abduction involved the false reporting of a death, which could potentially be charged as murder. Are you saying you want to prosecute my father? Peter asked, a defensive edge creeping into his voice, despite everything he now knew. Richard Miller is deceased, Agent Delgado said gently, but we still need to understand exactly what happened. There may have been accomplices, and we need to provide answers for Martha Reynolds and for you. Peter exhaled slowly. What do you need from me? Today, we'd like to take a formal statement, Agent Delgado replied. Everything you remember about your childhood, particularly any memories from around age 6. We'd also like permission to access your father's financial and travel records from 1979 onward. We've prepared a timeline of the days surrounding Tommy's disappearance, Detective Moretti added, sliding a folder across the table. I thought it might help trigger memories. Peter opened the folder hesitantly. Inside was a detailed account of October 15, 1979, and the days that followed. Statements from witnesses, photos of search parties, a map marking Tommy's route home and where his lunchbox had been found. And there were photos of Martha and David Reynolds, his biological parents, their faces drawn with anguish as they appealed for information about their missing son. Peter studied his birth father's face with particular intensity. The man had died in 2012, according to the file, never knowing what had happened to his son. I don't know how much help I'll be, Peter said finally. I have very few memories from before I was 6. It's like there's a wall in my mind. That's not uncommon in cases of childhood trauma, Agent Delgado assured him. Sometimes the memories return over time. Sometimes they don't. We'll work with what we have. For the next 3 hours, Peter recounted his life as Peter Miller, growing up in Columbus until age 16, then moving to Seattle with his father. He described Richard Miller as a loving but strict parent, a mechanical engineer who worked for various companies throughout his career. Sarah Miller, the woman he had known as his mother, had been a kindergarten teacher until her illness. Was there anything unusual about your home life? Agent Delgado asked. Any restrictions or rules that seemed excessive? Peter thought carefully. We moved a lot within Columbus, 4 different houses before I was 16. Dad always said it was for better school districts or to be closer to his work, and I wasn't allowed to have my picture taken at school. What? Caroline looked at him surprised. Dad always insisted on exempting me from school photos. He told me it was a privacy concern, that he didn't trust what schools did with the images. Peter frowned. I never questioned it much. It was just our family quirk. Detective Moretti exchanged a significant look with Agent Delgado. That would have prevented Tommy's image from appearing in yearbooks or school records. What about contact with extended family? Ada Harmon asked. There wasn't any, Peter replied. Dad said his parents died before I was born, and Mom, Sarah, was supposedly estranged from her family. We never celebrated holidays with relatives. It was always just the 3 of us. The isolation, the moves, the photo restrictions, all of it painted a picture of Richard Miller's efforts to keep Tommy Reynolds hidden in plain sight. Peter felt a wave of nausea as the deliberate nature of his father's actions became clearer. I have a question, he said suddenly. The search for Tommy Reynolds was national news. My face was everywhere. How did no one recognize me? Detective Moretti nodded, acknowledging the question's validity. We've been looking into that. Richard Miller moved you to a different suburb immediately, Westerville on the opposite side of Columbus. He enrolled you in a new school under your new name. Children's appearances change quickly, and without school photos, there was little chance of recognition. By the time you were 7 or 8, you would have looked different enough from your 6-year-old self that casual observers wouldn't make the connection. Peter absorbed this information silently, imagining the calculated efforts his father had made to erase Tommy Reynolds and create Peter Miller. The level of premeditation was chilling. "There's something else," Agent Delgado said, her tone gentling. "We found evidence that Richard Miller had been stalking the Reynolds family for at least a month before the abduction. He'd been parked near your school several times. He knew your route home." Peter closed his eyes, the room suddenly too bright, too warm. "Why?" he asked, the single word laden with decades of unknowing. "Why would he do this?" "We're still investigating his motive," Agent Delgado replied, "but we've discovered that Richard Miller worked briefly at the same company as David Reynolds in early 1979. He was laid off while David was promoted. There may have been resentment there." "He stole me because of a job?" Peter's voice rose in disbelief. "It's not that simple," Detective Moretti interjected. "We're also looking into Richard's personal history. He and his wife had been trying to have children for years without success. They'd been rejected for adoption due to Richard's history of depression. Taking you may have been an act of desperation as much as revenge." Peter stood abruptly, needing to move, to breathe. Caroline rose with him, her hand steady on his arm. "I think we need a break," she said firmly to the room. Agent Delgado nodded. "Of course. We can continue this afternoon if you're up to it." In the hallway, Peter leaned against the wall, his breathing shallow. "I can't reconcile any of this with the father I knew," he said to Caroline. "The man who taught me to fish, who came to every baseball game, who helped me apply for college." "People are complicated," Caroline replied gently. "What he did was unforgivable, but that doesn't erase the father he was to you." Peter shook his head. "Everything I thought I knew about myself, about my family, it was all built on someone else's pain, on Martha Reynolds' suffering. The weight of that knowledge pressed down on him like a physical force. Tomorrow he would meet the woman who had been waiting 44 years for the son who had been living less than 20 miles away for much of that time. What could he possibly say to her? How could anyone make amends for so much lost time? The morning of his meeting with Martha Reynolds dawned clear and warm. Peter had barely slept, rehearsing what he would say, how he would explain that he had no memory of being Tommy, that while the DNA confirmed their relationship, he was, in many ways, a stranger. Agent Delgado had arranged for the meeting to take place at Martha's home, the same blue two-story house on Elm Street where Tommy Reynolds should have arrived after school that October day in 1979. Martha had been informed of the DNA match and Peter's identity the previous day, with a counselor present to help her process the shocking news. "She's been waiting a long time for this," Agent Delgado told Peter and Carolyn as they pulled up in front of the house. "But please understand, this is overwhelming for her too. Take it slowly." Peter nodded, his gaze fixed on the house. The tire swing was long gone, but an oak tree still dominated the front yard. Wind chimes tinkled softly from the porch. Flower beds, meticulously maintained, lined the walkway. "Are you ready?" Caroline asked softly. Peter took a deep breath. "No, but I don't think I ever will be." They walked up the path together, Agent Delgado slightly ahead. Before they reached the steps, the front door opened and Martha Reynolds appeared. She was smaller than Peter had expected, her frame diminished by age, though she stood without assistance. Her silver hair was pulled back in a neat bun, and she wore a simple blue dress with a cardigan despite the warm day. But it was her eyes that captured Peter, deep brown exactly like his own, now wide with emotion as they took him in. For a long moment, no one moved or spoke. Peter felt frozen in place, the weight of 44 years of separation suspended between them. Then Martha spoke, her voice surprisingly strong and clear. "Tommy," she said simply, and the name sent a jolt through Peter like an electrical current. He climbed the steps slowly, stopping an arm's length from her. "Mrs. Reynolds," he began formally, unsure what else to call her. "I'm Peter Miller. I believe I'm your son, though I don't remember—" He didn't finish the sentence. Martha had closed the distance between them, her hands reaching up to touch his face with trembling fingers. Her eyes searched his, taking in every feature with hungry intensity. "I would know you anywhere," she whispered. "Your father's chin, my mother's eyebrows." Her fingers brushed his cheek. "My eyes." Something shifted inside Peter at her touch. A door, long sealed, suddenly unlocked. In a rush of sensation, he remembered the scent of her perfume, the feeling of smaller hands held in hers, the sound of her humming as she made breakfast. "Mom!" The word escaped him before he could think, rising from somewhere deep and forgotten. Martha's face crumpled, and she pulled him into an embrace. Peter found himself bending down to accommodate her height, his arms encircling her fragile shoulders as decades of separation collapsed in an instant of recognition that transcended conscious memory. Behind them, Caroline and Agent Delgado watched silently, bearing witness to a reunion that statistics and experience had deemed nearly impossible. A mother and son, torn apart by malice, reunited by science and stubborn hope. Inside Martha's home, time had performed a curious trick. While the kitchen had been modernized and the furniture replaced over the years, photographs of Tommy Reynolds charted a life never lived. School photos that had been age-progressed by artists, marking phantom milestones. Birthdays never celebrated. Graduations never attended. Martha led Peter to the living room, unwilling to release his hand as they sat on the sofa. Caroline settled in a nearby armchair, and Agent Delgado discreetly positioned herself by the door, giving them space while remaining present. "I never gave up," Martha said, her voice steady despite the tears that streaked her cheeks. "They all told me I should move on, except that you were gone. But I knew. A mother knows." Peter swallowed hard. "I wish I remembered more. I have fragments, feelings. But Richard..." He still struggled to call him anything but father. "He made sure I forgot." Martha nodded, understanding in her eyes. "You were only 6. Children adapt. They survive." She squeezed his hand. "I don't blame you for forgetting. I'm just grateful you're alive, that you've had a good life." The generosity of her response overwhelmed Peter. This woman who had endured decades of uncertainty and grief was offering forgiveness he hadn't even thought to ask for. "Tell me about yourself," Martha urged. "Everything. I want to know all the years I missed." And so Peter began to talk about growing up in Columbus and later Seattle, about meeting Caroline in college, about their children, Sam and Lily, Martha's grandchildren. He spoke of his career, his hobbies, the life he had built as Peter Miller. Martha listened with unwavering attention, occasionally brushing away tears, but mostly nodding and smiling, absorbing the details of the life that had continued beyond her reach. "You have a family of your own," she said when he finished. "Children, a whole life." "Yes," Peter acknowledged, "but there's room in that life for you now, if you want." Martha's smile trembled. "I've waited 44 years to be your mother again. Nothing would make me happier." In that moment, surrounded by the physical evidence of Martha's decades-long vigil, Peter understood that while he couldn't reclaim the past, couldn't become Tommy Reynolds again, he could offer Martha Reynolds a future that included her son. Not the 6-year-old boy who disappeared, but the man that boy had become. And as the afternoon light slanted through the windows, the same windows that had framed Martha's vigil for over 4 decades, Peter felt something shift within him, the beginning of a reconciliation between Peter Miller and Tommy Reynolds, between the life he had lived and the one that had been taken from him. The box of photographs sat between them on Martha's kitchen table, its cardboard edges soft with age and handling. Outside, a summer thunderstorm rolled across Columbus, rain drumming against the windows in rhythmic pulses. It had been 6 weeks since Peter had first met Martha, 6 weeks of cautious connection, of stories shared, of questions both answered and created. "This was your 3rd birthday," Martha said, passing him a faded Polaroid. "You insisted on wearing your cowboy hat, even though it was 90 degrees that day." Peter studied the image. A small boy with a gap-toothed grin, perched on a chair before a cake shaped like a horse. The cowboy hat sat askew on his head, almost covering his eyes. Behind him stood a younger Martha, laughing, and beside her David Reynolds, the father Peter had never really known. "Did I like horses?" Peter asked, still adjusting to discussing a childhood he couldn't fully recall. "You were obsessed," Martha smiled. "You called every animal with 4 legs a horse for a while, dogs, cats, even a turtle we saw at the park once." These sessions had become a ritual during Peter's extended stay in Columbus. Martha would share photographs and memories, and occasionally, like distant lightning, something would flash in Peter's mind, a fragment of recollection, a sensory memory, a feeling. The therapist he was seeing called it memory retrieval through contextual stimulation. Peter called it getting to know himself. Caroline had returned to Seattle after 2 weeks to check on their home and to help their children process the extraordinary revelations about their father's identity. Peter had remained in Ohio, renting a small apartment near Martha's home, splitting his time between cooperating with the ongoing FBI investigation and rebuilding a relationship with the mother he had lost. "Sam and Lily want to meet you," Peter said, setting down the photo. "They're flying in next weekend. Caroline's coming back with them." Martha's eyes brightened. "I would love that." Her fingers trembled slightly as she sorted through more photos. "Grandchildren. I never thought I'd have grandchildren." The word hung between them, laden with meaning. Peter had struggled with what to call Martha. She was biologically his mother, but the word Mom still felt strange on his tongue, a name that belonged to Sarah Miller in his conscious memory. He had settled on Martha for now, which she had accepted with characteristic grace. But when Sam and Lily called her Grandma, it would forge a connection that transcended the years of separation. "I found something yesterday," Martha said, reaching for a folder beside the photo box. "I thought you might want it." Inside was a birth certificate. Thomas James Reynolds, born April 12, 1973, to Martha and David Reynolds. "I've kept it all these years," Martha said softly. "Even when people told me to put away your things, to accept that you were gone, I couldn't." Peter touched the document gently, tracing his original name. For 50 years, he had been Peter Miller. Now, legally, he was both. Peter Miller on his driver's license, work identification, and marriage certificate. Tommy Reynolds on this birth certificate and in the FBI case files. The duality was disorienting. He wasn't fully Peter anymore, but he couldn't fully become Tommy again either. He existed in a liminal space between identities. "The FBI finished their search of Richard's storage unit in Seattle," Peter said after a moment. "They found journals, detailed records from 1979. Martha's expression tightened. "What do they say?" Peter had been grappling with whether to share this information. The journals Agent Delgado had shown him revealed a disturbed man whose obsession with the Reynolds family had festered over months. Richard Miller had detailed his grievances against David Reynolds, his feelings of inadequacy, and his growing fixation on their son. "He planned it meticulously," Peter said finally. "He'd watched your house, tracked Tommy's routine. He was..." Peter struggled to find the words. "Deeply unwell. There were delusions. He convinced himself that Tommy, that I, was actually his son, that you had somehow stolen me from him." Martha's face paled. "But we'd never even met him before David worked with him briefly." "I know. It wasn't rational." Peter ran a hand through his hair, a gesture Martha had noted was identical to David's. In his mind, taking me was reclaiming what was rightfully his. "And Sarah, the woman who raised you?" Martha asked. The question of Sarah Miller's involvement had hung between them, unaddressed until now. "The journal suggests she didn't know at first," Peter replied. "Richard told her he'd adopted me legally after my birth parents died in an accident. By the time she might have suspected something, they were already living as a family. Maybe she didn't want to know the truth." The thunderstorm outside intensified, a crack of lightning illuminating the kitchen in stark white before plunging it back into grey half-light. The weather matched the turbulence Peter felt whenever he tried to reconcile the loving father he remembered with the deeply disturbed man revealed in the journals. "There's something I need to ask you," Peter said, meeting Martha's eyes. Something I've been thinking about ever since I learned who I really am. Martha nodded, waiting. Did you ever imagine this? Not just finding me alive, but finding me like this? With a whole life I don't remember losing, with another family who raised me? Martha was quiet for a long moment, considering. In the early years, I imagined every scenario, that you'd been taken by someone who wanted a child, that you were living somewhere, maybe even happy, but not knowing who you really were. She looked down at her hands, weathered by time and grief. Later, when the years stretched on with no answers, I tried not to imagine specifics. It was too painful. I just held on to the belief that you were out there, somewhere. How did you do it? Peter asked. Keep hoping for 44 years. What choice did I have? Martha replied simply. You were my son, my child. The alternative, accepting that you were gone forever, was impossible. She reached across the table, taking his hand, and I was right. You were alive. You were safe. In some strange way, you even had a family who loved you. It's not what I would have chosen. I would have given anything to raise you myself, but you survived. You thrived. Peter squeezed her hand, humbled by her resilience. I've been thinking about what happens next, about who I am now. And what have you decided? Martha asked. I don't think I can ever fully be Tommy Reynolds again. Too much time has passed. I've built my life as Peter. He took a deep breath. But I don't want to deny that part of myself either. So I've been thinking of legally changing my name to include both identities, Peter Thomas Miller Reynolds. Martha's eyes filled with tears. I think that's perfect. And I want you to be part of our family, Martha, not just meeting Sam and Lily once, but really being their grandmother, being in our lives. I'd like that very much, Martha said, her voice thick with emotion. Outside, the storm began to recede, the spaces between thunder growing longer, the rain softening from downpour to gentle patter. A beam of late-afternoon sunlight broke through the clouds, casting a golden rectangle on the kitchen floor. There's something else, Peter said. The FBI has officially closed the case. They're holding a press conference tomorrow to announce that Tommy Reynolds has been found. Our story will become public. Martha nodded. I expected that. It was such a high-profile disappearance. Agent Delgado wants us both there, but we don't have to do it if you don't want to. No, I think we should, Martha said firmly. For 44 years, I've spoken to reporters, television stations, anyone who would listen, trying to keep your case alive. Now I finally have something to celebrate, and maybe our story will give hope to other families still waiting for answers. The press conference was held on the steps of the FBI field office, a bank of microphones set up before a gathering of reporters and cameras. Peter stood between Martha and Caroline, with Sam and Lily, who had flown in early when they heard about the press conference, flanking them. Agent Delgado spoke first, outlining the basic facts of the case. How Tommy Reynolds had been abducted in 1979, how a commercial DNA test had led to his identification 44 years later, and how the investigation had determined that Richard Miller, now deceased, was responsible for the kidnapping. Then Martha stepped forward, her small frame straight and dignified despite the emotions of the moment. For 44 years, I've stood before cameras asking for help finding my son, she began, her voice clear and steady. Today, I stand before you with my son beside me. She reached for Peter's hand. Our story isn't the one I would have written. We've lost decades we can never get back, but we've found each other now, and for that I am eternally grateful. When it was Peter's turn to speak, he had prepared remarks, but as he looked out at the sea of faces, journalists who had followed the Tommy Reynolds case for years, members of the public who had grown up seeing Tommy's age-progressed photos on milk cartons and billboards, officers who had worked the case over decades, he set his notes aside. I grew up as Peter Miller, he said simply. I had no idea I had once been Tommy Reynolds. I had no memory of being taken, of having another family, another identity. I grew up loved by the people who raised me, one of whom was responsible for causing unimaginable pain to the woman standing beside me today. He paused, gathering himself. I don't have answers for why this happened. I don't know how to reconcile the father I knew with the man who committed this crime. But I do know this. DNA doesn't just tell us who we're related to. It can reconnect lives torn apart by tragedy. It can bring truth to light after decades of darkness. Peter turned slightly, including both Martha and his wife and children in his gaze. I stand here today between two families, the one I was born to and the one I created. I'm both Peter Miller and Tommy Reynolds. And while I can't change the past, I can embrace a future that honors both parts of who I am. After the formal statements, there were questions from reporters. Most were respectful, though a few pushed for sensationalistic details about Richard Miller or about Peter's emotional reaction to learning his true identity. How do you feel about the man who raised you now? One reporter called out. Peter considered the question carefully. Conflicted, he said finally. Richard Miller committed an unforgivable act that caused tremendous suffering. He also raised me, loved me, and helped shape me into the person I am today. Both of these things are true, and I'm still learning how to hold them together. As the press conference concluded, Peter noticed a familiar figure at the edge of the crowd, Detective Frank Moretti, who had worked the case from the beginning, now watching its resolution with visible emotion. Peter made his way over to the retired officer. "Detective," he greeted him, extending his hand. Moretti grasped it firmly. "I never gave up hope," he said, his voice gruff, "but I never expected this ending either." "None of us did," Peter acknowledged. "Thank you for everything you did to try to find me." Moretti nodded, words seemingly failing him. Then he reached into his pocket and pulled out a small object, pressing it into Peter's palm. "I think you should have this." It was a battered Batman pin, the enamel chipped at one corner. "It was on your lunchbox," Moretti explained. "When we found it after you disappeared. I kept it all these years, carried it like a reminder that the case wasn't closed." Peter stared at the small emblem, a tangible link to that October day when Tommy Reynolds had vanished and Peter Miller had been born. "Thank you," he said, his throat tight. "This means more than I can say." 3 months later, on a crisp September evening, Martha Reynolds sat on the porch of her blue house on Elm Street, watching as her grandchildren played an improvised game of tag in the front yard. Inside, Caroline and Peter were preparing dinner, their voices and laughter drifting out through the open windows. Martha's life had transformed in ways she could never have anticipated. After 50 years in Columbus, she was preparing to move to Seattle to be closer to Peter and his family. A small house had been found for her just 10 minutes from their home, the blue house on Elm Street, the home she had maintained for decades, in case Tommy ever found his way back, would be sold, its vigil finally complete. The story of Tommy Reynolds and Peter Miller had captivated the nation. There had been interviews, documentary requests, even talk of a book deal. Peter had declined most of the attention, preferring to focus on integrating this new chapter of his life privately, but he had agreed to work with the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children, sharing their story to promote DNA databases and family reunification efforts. The legal proceedings had been complex, but were now resolved. Peter had officially changed his name to Peter Thomas Miller Reynolds. The FBI had closed the case against Richard Miller, acknowledging that while he had committed serious crimes, his death meant no prosecution was possible. Sarah Miller's involvement remained ambiguous. There was evidence she had suspected the truth at some point, but no proof she had known from the beginning. Peter had chosen to remember the maternal love she had shown him, while acknowledging the moral complexity of her situation. Martha's reverie was interrupted as Lily bounded up the porch steps, her cheeks flushed with exertion. At 20, she had Martha's eyes and smile, genetic echoes that had skipped a generation. "Grandma, Dad wants to know if you prefer garlic bread or dinner rolls," she said, the term grandma now flowing naturally, as if Martha had always been part of their lives. "Garlic bread, definitely," Martha replied with a smile. "Tell him to use plenty of butter." As Lily dashed back inside, Martha reflected on the strange path that had led to this moment. 44 years of waiting, of hope sustained against overwhelming odds, had culminated not in the recovery of the 6-year-old boy she had lost, but in the discovery of the 50-year-old man he had become. A man with his own family, his own memories, his own life built on a foundation of deception, but filled with genuine love and achievement nonetheless. Peter emerged from the house, carrying 2 glasses of iced tea. He handed one to Martha before settling into the chair beside her. "Sam and Caroline are arguing about whether the sauce needs more oregano," he reported with amusement. "I decided to leave them to it." Martha sipped her tea, studying her son's profile in the golden evening light. Sometimes she caught glimpses of the boy he had been, in the way he tilted his head when listening, in his infectious laugh, in the furrow that appeared between his brows when he concentrated. Other times, like now, she saw more of David in him, along with elements that were uniquely Peter, shaped by experiences and relationships she hadn't been part of. "What are you thinking about?" Peter asked, noticing her gaze. "About time," Martha replied. "About how it takes things away, but sometimes gives them back in forms we don't expect." Peter nodded, understanding. "I've been having more memory fragments," he said. "The therapist thinks being around you is helping. Yesterday, I remembered a song you used to sing, something about a mockingbird." Martha's breath caught. "Hush, little baby. I sang it to you every night before bed." "I remembered your voice," Peter said softly. "Not the whole song, just the feeling of it, being safe, being loved." Martha reached out, taking his hand. No words seemed adequate for the moment, this miraculous second chance that defied all probability, all expectation. In the yard, Sam had joined the game with Lily, their laughter rising in the evening air. Through the windows, Caroline could be seen setting the table, moving with the comfortable familiarity of someone at home. And on the porch, mother and son sat together, witnessing the blending of past and present, of loss and recovery, of 2 families becoming one. The Batman pin from Tommy's lunchbox now hung on a keychain attached to Peter's house keys. He carried it everywhere, a small reminder of the journey that had brought him here, to this porch, to this moment of completion. Not an erasing of the past or a denial of the complexity, but an integration. Peter Thomas Miller Reynolds, both the boy who had vanished and the man who had been found. As the sun dipped toward the horizon, casting long shadows across the lawn of the house Martha had kept waiting for 44 years, she finally allowed herself to acknowledge a truth she had always known, but never dared fully believe. Some stories, even the most heartbreaking ones, could still find their way to a kind of ending that, if not perfect, was better than anyone could have imagined in the darkest moments. Her son had come home, different than expected, changed by time and circumstance, but home nonetheless. And in that homecoming was a reminder that hope, persistent, stubborn, against all odds hope, sometimes proved itself right in the end.